QuickBooks Enterprise 2021 Class Tracking Responsibility Accounting Overview. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Enterprise 2021. Here we are on the desktop. We have our QuickBooks Enterprise Solution program that we're going to be opening up and setting up a new company file within. Notice that this QuickBooks Enterprise Solution program is a free 30-day trial. So if you want to follow along, you can download the free 30-day trial and test it out along with us. Also note that if you have QuickBooks Pro, you can also set up a new company file and follow along, but you may not have some of the functionality with the problem that we will be working, which will include class tracking, responsibility accounting, basically using those classes to track responsibility accounting by different segments of the company, different centers or different departments. You will have access to the income statement side of things with QuickBooks Pro with regards to class tracking, but not the balance sheet side of things. And you also won't see the default kind of settings to be able to set a class by default. So I'm going to open up QuickBooks Enterprise, set up a new company file that we can work with, and then I'm going to store that company file here in our folder to the right. So double clicking on the program. Now the intro screen is going to look a little bit different than what it would be if you didn't have the test file. So we have the 30-day trial, but we could set up a new company file right here. So I'm going to set up a new company file and from this point forward, it will look the same as if you were, using the normal version of the QuickBooks file. It's just that intro screen that will be a little bit different. We're going to set up a new company file, and I'm going to use for someone else so that it doesn't pull over my information from Intuit, because I just want to put practice information in there. And then I'm going to call this class tracking. Let's call it responsibility accounting. That's going to be the name. Then we have the industry. I'm going to go ahead and select none or other for the industry because I don't want any chart of accounts over here. I'm just going to set up the chart of accounts as we go. So in other words, if you had an industry up top, that would provide you the chart of accounts that would be custom to that industry. I'm going to go to none so that we can just really concentrate on the accounts as we set them up in our little problem here. So I'm going to say OK. And then the business type, any of these types should work for us here. I'm going to use the S Corporation for our purposes. And then I'm just going to enter the email address. That's the last thing that has a little asterisk next to it, which means that you have to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. We don't need anything below that for the purposes of our practice problem. Therefore, I won't put anything into those items. I'm just going to put the email here, then continue. Here we have our file. I'm going to close out this item. I'm going to maximize the window here. I typically, when I go into this, will go to the View tab and then the Open Windows. So we have our Open Windows. Now note that it saved it somewhere on the desktop. We also want to go and find that. We'll do that shortly. But before we do, let's go ahead and just turn on the class tracking feature. So I'm going to go to the Edit dropdown. We're going to go down to the Preferences, and we have to turn on class tracking by going to the Accounting up top, Company Preferences. Now, the reason it's not on by default is because it really adds a field to many of the data input screens. So if you don't have it on, then it's a little bit cleaner to look at some of the data input screens, which will not have that added field of classes. Therefore, it's off by default typically, and then you would need to turn it on if wanting to use it. So I'm going to go down here to the class section, use class tracking. So it says prompt me to assign classes. That means that every time you record something and don't assign a class, it's going to say, hey, here's a prompt. I'm paraphrasing the little pop-up that pops up and says you didn't assign a class, and then you'll have to assign a class. Now, you also have this feature. This is the thing that will be different in Enterprise, or one of the things different from Enterprise than Pro, and that will be that you can assign the default class, which is really nice because that'll save you a lot of time from assigning a class to every transaction. Can also help you with basically making your separation of duties and whatnot, the data input, easier to designate to other people if you're able to assign default classes so that they don't have to think about, what class to assign each time they enter a transaction. I'm not going to turn that on for now. We'll take a look at that at a later point in time. So I'm going to go ahead and say OK. So now we'll have our classes on. If I go to the lists drop down, if I go to the class list, we now have a list of items, so we can add classes. We haven't added any here, but this would be a list of classes where I can say class dropdown or rise up, and we can set up a new class. And then if I close this back out, then when I create, say, a bill or something like that, or an invoice, we will have a class field. I'm not going to do that yet. I haven't set up a checking account. Let's do an invoice. If I open up an invoice, then we'll have a class field here. And the fact that we have a class field there kind of makes the invoice a little bit longer. So if we're not using classes, QuickBooks will default not to have them so that we don't have this added field. So you have to turn them on if you want to utilize them. So we're going to be closing this back out. Let's see if we can locate this file now on the desktop and put it where we would like to put it. So if I go to the file dropdown, usually I would close the company file if I wasn't in the sample version and then hover over that kind of open windows that has the previous located files there. But because we're in the sample version, it looks a little bit different. Another way you could do this to try to see where this file is, if you don't know where QuickBooks put it, is then to go to open or restore company file. I'm going to go to the open a company file instead of restoring it, and then I'm going to say next, and it'll generally take me to the place where the company file currently is to locate the file. So then I can locate the file, I can hit the drop down and say, okay, where did QuickBooks put this thing? Then I can go find it and place it where I want to put it. Now note that once you do this, you can't really open the file from here because you have to open it in the sample version from the sample screen. But this can help you basically to locate it, and then you can go back in there and move it to where you would like it to be. So here we are back on the desktop. We have the QuickBooks Enterprise program, and then we have the QBW file. Now the QBW file looks just like it would if we had a sample version of the program or the actual version of the program. When we open it, however, we'll typically want to go into the program, which will always go into that intro screen, and then we'll have to locate our company file from there, and we can open it from there, making adjustments to it just like we could if we're not using the sample version. Now let's take a look at the practice problem that we're going to be moving forward with. We're going to be looking at it in Excel, so we'll kind of think about it in Excel and then think about how we can put that information into QuickBooks. So we'll do this in a step-by-step type of process. If I go to the example tab over here, this is the completed problem, and we'll think about different departments or centers that we'll be setting up. We're going to have service centers. These will basically be centers that just have costs, or cost centers, in other words, no revenue related to them. And then our sales center, which are basically the revenue generation centers. So what we want to think of in terms of the profitability accounting when we want to start thinking about, okay, how are different segments of the organization doing, is seeing if we can allocate our income and expenses by these centers that we have. And then once we do that, we want to kind of further break it down. Like the cost centers, of course, when we measure how their performance is doing, we can't measure it by their net income or their revenue or how much revenue they're generating because they're a cost center, and that means no revenue will be generated. The reason we have the cost centers as a business is in order to generate revenue, and therefore these two centers are there and can be thought of as kind of a component of the sales centers, the revenue centers as well. So we might want to break out then. I'd like to break out the information by these centers separately, and then possibly combine those cost centers into the revenue generation centers so that we can then break it out in that format as well. So I want to say, okay, how can we use classes to break this information out by center, cost centers, revenue centers, and then possibly be able to condense all this information from the cost centers into the revenue centers with the help and use of classes. And some of these items that we look at are going to be fairly straightforward as well to allocate to these centers, such as the salaries, for example. If I have some person that works directly for one of these centers only, then it's easy for me to allocate the salary out because it's a direct allocation. Same with supplies. If I know exactly the supplies that go to each center, easy to allocate out. But it might be difficult to allocate something out like rent if all centers are in the same building. Then we'd have to figure out some way to allocate the rent out. So we have this problem as well, not just the problems of the logistics of class tracking, but the problems of, well, what about these types of costs that are going to be applicable to all centers? How am I going to allocate those out in terms of just what's the method for me to do it? And then two, how can I use class tracking to then allocate that out? To do that, we'll think about the activity bases. So we'll come up with activity bases to help us with those allocations. And then we can come up with a statement like this, which you can imagine being something similar to what you would see with class tracking, which is you have your income statement breaking out the sales items and the cost items. And then we have our operating expenses. These are the direct costs, salary, supplies, rent, utilities. And then we can allocate out the cost centers to our sales centers. So now we got our cost centers here on one line item that represent our one line item. And if we want more detail in it, we'd like to drill down on that cost center possibly and get the more detail of the activity within those cost centers, right? I'd like to be able to break down a report that would give me the line item of those cost centers that are included in the revenue centers here, and then be able to drill down on those cost centers further and see the actual details within those cost centers so that we can then do our responsibility accounting for those particular centers and see if they have met the goals that have been assigned to them. So that's one way that we can kind of see that. We can also see it in another kind of perspective. We could say, okay, here's the sales departments 1 and 2, and then here's the department contributions, and then think about those indirect costs kind of separately. These are the costs that are basically being allocated out: the rent, the utilities, the service department 1 and 2. So that'll be our task as we go forward. How can we kind of format this so that QuickBooks can automate that process, automate that system to give us more of that detail with the use of the class tracking? Now, all this information is basically income statement information, which means you can generally do it with QuickBooks Pro as well to have these kind of features. But also, what we will not have with QuickBooks Pro is the default, to set kind of the default tracking by account or by item. And then we also will not have the balance sheet side of things. So when we roll this stuff into the balance sheet, then it'll roll into the balance sheet basically by class as well. And we can then have our balance sheet be separated by department, allocating the information by department on the balance sheet side of things as well. When we think about responsibility accounting, we're often focusing in on the income statement, but we can do the same kind of ratio analysis and whatnot to see how well a department is doing in relation to their assets, liabilities, and how they're utilizing those things in order to help with the generation of revenue. So we'll do this in a piece-by-piece process, putting this into the practice file over here in Excel, and then thinking about how we can then include that into the QuickBooks system and build up basically the setting up of the class tracking in order to achieve some of the goals that we're seeing here on the Excel worksheet.